I'll record for anyone for whom that would be helpful. Sometimes I think that so the breakout rooms will be a really boring part of the recording, but I can also take them out in an editing process. So you'll have a chance to choose when I open the breakout rooms. You'll have a chance to choose either the anti-psychiatry movement, the anti-poverty movement, prison abolition movement, and self-select into that. My feeling is that we probably won't have the full class here today, because that's what happens by the end of the semester. Lives get much more complicated. So it's pretty impressive that 2/3 of you are here this morning. I think this will be a good discussion and a good opportunity to connect. I'm going to post just the assignment documents. So give me one sec. It's always tricky because people can't see it if they haven't come in yet. So I always want to wait until just about the last minute to post things. This is one downfall of Zoom, in my opinion. All right, so you should be able to, can you see the link that I put to the assignments? And then the other thing that I'm going to post is actually a Jamboard. If you want to use the Jamboard for putting down and posting your ideas and collaborating with, I know that some of you find it helpful, others not, but I will ask that you appoint someone in your group to be the person who leads the feedback of the conversation. Before we actually get started, is it more helpful for you to ask any questions about the assignments now, so that you make sure, so that you're not sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, here's how I'm feeling, and I can't really concentrate on this because I've got these questions about the assignment. If you have a question about your upcoming assignments, probably others will have similar questions. There's always more than one person who has the question, a question. So you are welcome to ask that. I apologize that I didn't change the due date actually on Quercus. Though I sent an email out that told you that you had an extra 4 days, but I think there was a little bit of confusion just from hearing from people. So I changed that yesterday or the day before, so that, if you are someone, if you submitted and you thought it was because the due date was yesterday, you're welcome to resubmit if that would be helpful for you. Anything that's submitted before the weekends, and there are a few submissions already, I'll have marked by Monday. And then if you submit on the 27th, I'm going to try to have everything marked by Thursday, so that you can ask me any questions about your assignments as well, so that you have feedback quickly before I recognize that in my interest of providing you with flexibility about when you hand assignments in, it does position the assignment due dates really close together. And so I hope it's been helpful to have that flexibility, but I'm going to try to make sure that you have some feedback from me before you submit your final assignment. Does that sound good? Any further questions or comments? How are things going? Are people feeling like they're keeping above water or just above water? in this final part of the semester? Yes, no, all right, fine, a little bit. Oh, so are these hands up questions? Okay, excellent. So Bevan.
Hello. Did you know that Air Canada Vacations now flies weekly from Calgary to Honolulu and Maui with convenient connections to and from the other points in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Toronto.
So I think someone has, there we go. That was awesome. That is great. If anyone is planning on taking a trip, we have some value. We have some value add. No problem, Asha. It's always good to have a little bit something unexpected in a class. So Bevan.
I don't remember what I was going to say. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm a bit confused about what is due on the 3rd and then what is expected in the week following. And then there's just a lot of dates in there.
There are. So this was so if we were, I was telling Faye this earlier, that if we were in person, we would have 3 hours and we would sit around a room and people would have the opportunity. We'd make it a bit of a celebration and you'd present and give feedback and all of those things. So I wanted to still provide that kind of opportunity. And so part 3 of assignment number 2, so your artistic or creative output, that is due on the 3rd. And why is that due on the 3rd? It's due on the 3rd so that your colleagues can have some time to reflect on it. Now, I will tell you, and you can all give me feedback, if you would prefer to hand it in, if it would be helpful to have extra days, I could still, like, because everything is virtual, everyone can visit the Padlet after our final session on the 7th. 7th is on the 7th of April. So I could give you an extra few days to work on the creative piece. And then our last class will be more reflections on learning. So it doesn't have to, your comments and your feedback to your colleagues is going to happen on a Padlet board. So you could keep doing that. I can keep the Padlet board open until, say, April 20th, so that you actually have more time to actually look at what your colleagues have created. So you tell me how that works for you. In my mind, I thought it would be nice to have it done and so that people could comment on some of those things during our final session. However, there will be lots of things around the learning that you can comment on in terms of our final reflection questions without having handed in your creative assignments. So I will actually let you all think of, and then on the 15th is what's due is part 4, which is the reflection. So a reflection on your process. What I would love to do ideally is have you have some feedback from your colleagues to be able to integrate that into your reflection. So that was the idea of the assignment, because I think that because this is creative, because this is about consciousness raising, it would be ideal for you to have some comments from colleagues. So that's why I made the deadlines where they are. However, I also recognize that these continue to be extraordinary circumstances and lots of things are due at the same time, which is not good for health and well-being. And so my primary concern is that you have the proper amount of time to do the work that you want to do. So we can negotiate a final date for the submission of your part 3, if that's helpful. And I throw that out to the whole class. It could be due April 7th, or it could be due April 10th, so that there's at least a few days before before you actually need to submit that final reflection so that people have an opportunity to give some feedback to each other. Thoughts on that? I know if I ask students if they want an extension, no one's going to say, forget it. I don't want an extension. That's ridiculous. So, so you tell me, show of hands, option 1 is, and Faye, I still see that your hand is up, and I'll come to you. I'll come to you next. But if I do an extension for part 3 until, would you prefer April 7th or April 10th? And the reason I even give that option is that you know what you have due at other times as well. So sometimes extensions are not particularly, are not always helpful. So April 10th, I see lots of April 10ths. So if I make the extension April 10th, you can hand in your assignment whenever you get it finished. Does that sound like a good plan? And I'll still keep, I will also extend the reflection paper for an extra 4 days. Does that sound? Oh, so yeah, Faye, this is the trick. So if anyone is graduating, no problem. So if you're handing it in on April 10th, Faye, then I can still turn it around in a day. That happened to a few students last year when I gave an extension. So I will make sure that both of your and Kevin, so both of your things will need to be submitted to me by the end of the day on the 10th. So both part 3 and part 4. And then I will, and anyone else who is graduating, and congratulations to all of you who are at the point of graduating, and for all the work that you've put into getting to this space. Yeah, and Faye, your partner in crime is going to also have to submit by April 10th. So sorry about that, GIE. Okay, so I will update all of that on Quercus so that you know, and I will also clarify it as well in my follow-up email and in an announcement so that you're really clear about when things are due. Does that relieve some stress from people? Yeah, good. Okay, Annie.
Yeah, about assignment or part 3.
Yeah.
We upload not to Quercus, but the Google Drive folder.
Yeah.
And so are you looking for the complete piece, whatever we're doing, and then also a visual and an audio of that piece?
Okay, so it depends on what you're doing. The reason that I chose a Google Drive is because Quercus can't handle all different files. And so Google Drive can handle almost every file type you can imagine. And so you're required to upload your creative piece. And some of you, so for example, some of you are working with Kappa, and you will not have your final project by that time. Maybe you have talked to me as well about another project that has an action that you're participating in that you won't be able to, that won't be completed before May. Then you just need to put something that is representing what you're doing. And there's a 2 to 3 minute explanation that could be a video, could be an audio, could be half a page of written. And it's just your classmates' way of you inviting. So if we were sitting around in a nice circle, we would all be just saying a little bit about what the process was like, why you chose to do this, why this was important to you. So a little bit of reflection, and what maybe even what questions you have. If you if it felt complicated to you, or if you wonder if you've achieved, what were your goals in the project, and what do you want your classmates to comment on? So I've had students in the past write like a couple of paragraphs. I've had students walk along the street and do a little dialogue on what they've done. I've had students do an audio piece. Whatever you feel most comfortable with, please feel free to do that. But that just invites all of us into the work that you've done, and what you want to achieve as well, and maybe even where you want to go from there. Because the other piece is that one of the things that I've talked with a number of you about is scope. So you had this big idea, and I said, that is so great, and I really want you to do that, but for the purposes of this course, think about scope. So maybe this is one piece of a larger piece for you, and you would like to do something more. So include that in your overall reflection, but include that for your classmates as well, to let them know what you were inspired to do, and what was interesting to you. Or even include, I wanted to do this, but it wasn't possible, and maybe in the future I'll do this. You can include what you really liked about doing this, or what was challenging about doing it. So everything is, there are a number of reflection questions that I've included on your like the part 4. Those are just some questions to help. Some people really love to answer questions. Some people like to be more creative and to not answer questions because that's too constricting. So we're all wired a little bit differently. So you're welcome to use any of the suggestions that I've made, but also welcome to do something that is completely different than what I proposed. Make sense? Did I answer your question in a very, very long way, Annie?
I think so. So just
yeah,
like I am writing a dialogue, so kind of a play script,
yeah.
but it's a long thing. It's turning out to be a longer thing than I imagined. But the kind of thing that I'm uploading is more of a summary of that and my thoughts about that, or is it that whole piece as well?
So I would do both, because your classmates, especially if they're giving feedback after all the rest of their assignments are due, might be interested in reading the whole thing, but include the summary just in case that is not something that people feel able to manage. And I want to read the whole thing. And I'll be looking at the same folder when I'm giving feedback. So please feel free to do that. Like if you've got something that is longer, for example, I know Carlos and Sinette, you have a lot of information for your project. You could include a summary of what you did in terms of your project and the full piece if you want, just so that your classmates don't have the option of accessing the whole piece or accessing a summary to get a sense of what you did. So everyone, since there are 27 people in this class, it makes for a lot of, one of the things I've also said is you can also choose like 4 or 5 people that you want to give feedback to as well. And so, but there are others I know who will want to look at everyone's, but I don't want anyone to feel, I don't want this process to be an overwhelming process. I want it to be an informative and inspiring process. Is that okay, Annie? Yeah. Anyone else have a question about assignment number 1 or assignment number 2?
Just very quickly. So in my reflections, the second one, I'm just finding it enmeshed between the week on illicit drug use and on psychiatry and prisons. I'm trying to filter it down,
Sure.
so at least
Yeah.
it's a conversation between 2 weeks, if that's
Yeah, sure.
coherent enough. Can we?
Yeah, you can absolutely do that. And a few people already, you sir, have asked me that. And it makes sense. It makes sense that there are ways that they're talking to each other. So you're welcome to do that, to put them together. That's one of the things that happens when you've seen all 5 of them. And it's actually really great that you're making connections between these different movements as well. Okay, any other questions? All right, so
Sorry, I have one.
Oh yeah, sure, no problem.
This is kind of a what if question,
Yeah,
so maybe
sure.
it's kind of silly, but you just mentioned that in terms of giving feedback, we don't have to give feedback to everyone. But what happens if no one gives you any feedback? Like what happens if no one responds to your project?
So it's never happened yet that happens.
Okay.
So I would ask that, and I will send an email out to ask that if you see someone who doesn't have a lot of feedback on their Padlet, please prioritize them. So we'll make sure, because the first 5 people who are listed alphabetically might very well be the people who get the most. So I will encourage people to look at and make sure that everyone gets feedback. So yeah, because that's terrible. It's like getting chosen last for a team in sports, which I experienced a lot in elementary and secondary school, and that's terrible. But I'll make sure that that doesn't happen. But you will all need to work at making sure that doesn't happen as well. So to ensure that the feedback that would happen so naturally as part of an in-person, this is the one piece that is harder to replicate in this virtual environment. So we will also have a time to reflect on, and in our final week, in week 12, will just be a time to respond to each other, respond to the learning, and think about the future as well. So there'll be some more time to do that as well. Yeah, and I don't doubt, given how engaged all of you are and how honoring you are of each other, and the kind of space that you've contributed to creating in this course, that anyone will be the last one picked for the sports team. I hope you all read, and I want to highlight that Lorraine from Walls to Bridges said that she had never felt such a sense of acceptance from a group that she presented to, and that you really contributed to creating that, and that really speaks volumes to what you give of yourselves, and what and how you interact with others. So thank you so much. When I hear things like that from guest speakers who are coming in for an hour and a half, that really makes really speaks volumes to who you are as individuals, and as and the community that you've contributed to creating. So thank you. Okay, any other questions? And Bevan, I love that you asked that question. Okay. Carlos, yeah.
Just a quick one, Professor, since as you stated, me and Sinet are going to be presenting something visual. Would Google Drive have the capacity to hold the video that we're going to?
Yeah, it does, and it's on my Google Drive, and I have the most massive number of gigabytes on my on my Google Drive, because since COVID started. So don't worry, even if it's 16 gigabytes, I'll still be able to accommodate it.
Yeah, no, I shrunk the video, so hopefully
Yeah, no
it'll be
problem.
okay.
Yeah, so the reason I chose Google Drive is that, in fact, I actually, if you look on assignment number 2, you'll see that I also included all of the different at the end, which looks like a very boring list, but it's all the different types of formats that Google Drive supports. And if you have trouble with it at all, if there's an issue, so you're trying to upload at 11:58 p.m. on the 10th of April, and something's not working, please don't panic. We'll figure it out. We'll figure out a way to share things. So don't worry. But thank you. It's another, yet all this technical stuff also gets complicated. So you know what? I try to think through all the things that might happen, and you know what? Things change and shift, and so it doesn't always. So there's always something to manage. But please know, I'm flexible, and I'm on your. I will work with you till we figure something out if there's an issue. Okay. And also, please let me know, and I'll just remind you of something that I said in the first half of the semester, which is, if there is some drama going on with you right now, if these dates did not relieve you and you are feeling very overwhelmed, and you're not sure where to go and how to go there, then please reach out to me, because there are absolutely ways that I can support you in this, but I can't support you if I don't know what's going on. So just reach out if you're feeling like things are moving a bit too fast and you're wondering if you can keep up with things. So academia creates these spaces, and then you add in, creates the frenzied piece at the end of a semester, and our lives, and combined with all the things that are in our lives, that can really contribute to stress that can seem unmanageable. But I promise you that in 15 years of teaching, I have never encountered an issue that cannot be resolved. So just know that for sure. Okay, wonderful. Okay. I am going to, just for anyone who just came in, I'll just re-upload the instructions. And I'm going to open up the breakout rooms, and you can choose which breakout room you want to go into. On the document is also a connection to the Google Jamboard if you want to use that to connect together and to collaborate together. The other thing is that you don't have to, the most important thing about this is to discuss. All of these things are long-term counter-hegemonic movements, and you're not required to solve everything. Okay, you, sir, that was really spooky to have you walk in through this with your coffee, but it was cool. All right, so I'll drop in on each of your groups. Choose what you'd like. If you end up in a group and no one else chose it, then I'll be able to see that, and I'll come and tell you that maybe you should move to another group. Sound good? All right, I'm opening the rooms. When I was a student, I was always the person who was talking when things were cut off. So I hope you had a good discussion. I was able to follow the discussion of our harm reduction group because they posted on Google Jamboard, but I am sure that all of you had I'm hoping that all of you had a good discussion, that it was also challenging as well as you thought about as you thought about the questions and the possibilities. I turned the recording off while everyone was jumping back in and out, because that's never a fun thing to look at when you're on a video. It's a little bit disconcerting, but I started recording again. Is there a group that would like to go first in terms of sharing what your discussion, sharing your discussion? Annie, you look very, you either look like you shouldn't smile like that if you don't want someone to reach out to you.
I'm just looking at Tanya, actually.
Oh, were you okay?
We're in the same group, and we're really wrestling like more about kind of like philosophical and
Okay.
sort of the philosophy behind prison abolition and safety and community, and just like wrestling with all of that. So we didn't address, I don't think we addressed the questions right on. Just
it's okay. That is fine. A good discussion and wrestling and sitting in discomfort around things is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. So I don't expect that anyone comes out of this course with the answer, because I don't think there is the answer. I think that, but I think the discussion and wrestling with things is really important. So what was the tension that you discussed in prison abolition? Both of you are welcome to share from that. Were you the two proponents of with different philosophical approaches?
There was just a lot of questions more than anything. And I think,
okay.
I know Tanya's like, no, but she started off like really asking really deep questions. And then we really sort of got into like what, sort of my questions that I introduced in the group was like, how are we defining what crime is? And I think that actually part of that description of the prison abolition, like, so the line here, the movement strives to make possible a different reality in which poverty, mental illness, addiction, racism, and gender violence are not pathways to prison. And so that kind of started us off in thinking about, how we're defining crime and who a criminal is or might be. How in looking at these sort of what the description is calling pathways, what are alternatives that maybe are more community based, that are maybe not sort of creating like a binary between like who is a victim, who is a true victim, who is a true criminal, that kind of thing. And then, but then what does that lead us to? We were talking about anarchy a little bit, and like, expectations of safety, and are we entitled to it, and who do we get safety from? So just more questions. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add, but just yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, like, it sounds like it was a really interesting discussion. And I don't think, like, I think it is a very, this idea that there is a prison industrial complex makes it complex. So I have a few, and not easily solved in 20 minutes in a session in any way. So Asha, and then you, sir.
I missed some of the conversation, but I was able to hop back in when Bevan made a great point, which I loved, which spoke to, if I miss anything, Bevan, but highlighted anarchy, and that it's actually, there's communities of care within that framework. And it just brought me to thinking about, and it's not in the Canadian context, actually, if we're thinking like Western world, they call like developing countries, it's in the developing country context where we look at smaller communities that have, so for example, like Jamaica, or if we're thinking about like maybe Colombia or Brazil or Mexico, where within communities they have, which we may deem or folks may deem as like anarchy. They have structures that exist within, like, so for example, like drug lords. So it's like a complex system where these smaller communities have their own way of policing, own way of being, and own way of caring and security for members of that community, which we actually, so we like demonize, criminalize, et cetera, but in many ways, it's outside of the systems that we know community of care to exist. And so Bevan's question really got me thinking about other alternatives to security that actually exist and that work, where policing doesn't necessarily enter the borders, but they're still bound by these sort of larger overarching systems of the prison industrial complex. And then they're complicated by crime and poverty, et cetera. But when we're looking at security and care, they do exist and they work in many ways. So I just wanted to add that point.
Yeah, that's a great point, Asha. Like, I think that even in a Canadian context, there are policing systems, or not policing systems, but there are systems of care and response to violence, and within Indigenous communities. So that the whole idea of restorative justice was birthed out of historical and traditional Indigenous practices, where the community is involved, that it looks at everyone as being the victim. So the person who committed the crime, but because of the circumstances that may have led them into that space, which, so it's so, like, I think you're right. There are definitely places where this happens. Bevan, did you want to just respond to Asha before I let you, sir, speak, because she directly commented on your comments?
Sure. Sorry to butt ahead of you, sir. Yeah, it was this idea of like, is there anarchy or is there like order? And my comment was about what Asha framed out as like, within anarchy, there is care and there's systems of care and structure. But just a local example I wanted to throw out there is JFAP. So the Jane Finch Action Against Poverty. I think I have the name right, but they do incredible self-care support, like really pushing out those borders, resisting police intervention in the community. So just an amazing group to check out.
Okay, thanks so much, Bevan. And you, sir, thanks for being patient.
It's okay. Just very quickly, Agatha, I think we've got a lot to go through, but I feel the issue is philosophical. As they said, it's about human nature. Do we believe in the alternative? Do we believe that we can care for each other beyond monetary exchange in the service provider-client context? And Razan and I were talking about it just a couple of days ago, how this has been wiped out from our imaginary, even though it existed for so long. And even when you think about a crime, think about the most heinous crimes, murder. And I remember in my previous master's, I did transitional justice, and the first example that came were the Gacaca courts in Rwanda. So you're talking neighbors killing neighbors, and still the form of justice that the families had sought were communal, all types of courts called gacaca, where it's very much emphasizing a mother confronting the murderer of her son and such dynamics. And there was still some state role, so you can argue for co-optation, but the idea that it's not a very radical example. Sometimes we think it's radical, but it has existed for so long, and even in response to very heinous crimes such as murder. And that in itself, just remembering to see that, gives you a sense of what is possible. And I think that gets swept up when we're so relied on using the police and calling on the law to actually justify and understand our own action. There is a potential within us that we haven't harnessed very well.
Yeah, thank you, you, sir. I think that you're right. This idea, the first time that I ever taught this course and introduced this idea of defund the police, and this idea, the whole class had a heart attack, because it wasn't something that people, because we have this idea that, like, just like questioning forms of knowledge, right? So questioning medicine or questioning the way that we are governed, we're taught that these things are absolute, and not to question it within this context. The conversation is different, I think, because people are more aware. But you're right. There are great examples, and it isn't often left field somewhere that these radicals are suggesting these ideas. We have evidence-based examples. Tanya, the one who asked great questions and swayed the conversation.
No, I think this is great. I really enjoy being able to do this in the wider class so that we can also get more perspectives. So I love that. I love restorative justice, and I think it came up in our discussion with the actual panel that brought this up. So I love this. I'm aware of this. I love it. But I think restorative justice typically targets victims of crimes and victims who have committed crimes, but doesn't address general public who have not, but are afraid of being victims of crime.
Right. Good.
People who are just afraid of being in proximity to this, and their ideas of safety and their entitlement to that upholding of safety, and providing them with this idea that, like, if you do become victimized by crime, then we're going to try to give you a pathway to heal from that and get through that. I don't know if that's the message that they're looking for. I think some people are looking for alternative safety. So I love the idea of community safety and community regulations. I love that, but I don't know what that does as far as answering those micro challenges around segregation, wanting to be far away from these ideas of crime, and their ideas of being able to manage that. And then also putting that responsibility on communities, which I think, if we grow with it and we foster with that, what that will actually require. It requires a lot of unlearning. It requires a lot of checking of entitlements. It requires a lot of new philosophical thinking. And then when you require that of people and you're asking for them to find how that intersects with their other ideas and self-identities, how that intersects with their ideas of religion, intersects with their ideas of family dynamics, where that intersects with their idea of gender roles, there's going to be a lot of collisions there in those spaces for different people. So now we're asking for our mass communities to all hold the same viewpoint on something, which a lot of communities have made it very clear they're not interested in doing. So for me, the abolition movement as it currently stands is doing, rightfully so, attacking macro systems that affect the prison complex, but it isn't addressing the individual, the community held perspectives that are also upholding the need or the requirement for policing and the prison system. And I think that's what we were talking about, is how do we address those concerns? How do we, are those concerns even valid? Are we supposed to tell people that you're actually not entitled to safety and that you are now imposing on other people's ideas of freedom by wanting to be safe, but your current definition of safe, right? So those, welcome to our breakout room.
Yeah. Well, I'm surprised you didn't resolve all of this in the 20 minutes that I gave you. So no, that's great. It's interesting just from a policy perspective, and I'm aware that we have two other groups to speak to as well. But they, I think 3 years ago, in Ontario at least, we had community safety departments emerge and funding for community safety within municipalities. But they really, what I have observed, and we even have within the college that I work at full time, a community safety degree, which combines social work and policing. So an interesting thing, it's an emergent degree. But I think that this concept is one that people are thinking about, but they have no idea how to do it. And so that's where it's addressing systems rather than people, like you say, and changing on multiple levels, because prison industrial complex, the whole complex that exists around policing really, really has so many different layers. So thank you. I'm glad you were able to express the things that have been stewing with you. Razan, I know that you had your hand up, and Carlos, Razan, was there something that you still wanted to say?
No. I had like a tiny thought, and then Tanya addressed it, which was amazing,
awesome.
and then also gave me too much to think about right now. So
okay,
we're just gonna move on to Carlos.
Okay, so Carlos, and then we'll move on to harm reduction. So harm reduction people, be ready to share in.
Yeah, no. Similar to Razan, like, Tanya pretty much explained a lot of what I was thinking, and really made me even think even more. But I just wanted to say that I think one of the biggest tools that the state uses to obviously control and maintain control is fear. I think the fear aspect that they introduce to society then leads people to, I'm okay with you. You kind of give up your civil liberties, and surrender that to the state. Like, you protect me. Like, the main thing that and people lose, I think a lot of times people lose critical thinking aspect because of fear. So I think fear is just one of the biggest tools that the state utilizes to pit people against one another, to label people, to, just to keep power. It's a great power tool that I think doesn't get talked about a lot.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Carlos. I think that's great. I think past experience and past knowledges contribute to future fear, anxiety, and worry. So what we think we know contributes to that as well. And people have experience of violence, which also can contribute to, which don't necessarily come from the police, although there are people who have experience of violence from the police that informs their experience and how they respond and react as well. Okay, Razan.
Yeah, I guess I'm just gonna circle back. I think, how do I word this? So I love engaging in all of these critical discussions, and they definitely leave me with a lot of questions to ponder on later on. But something that's been like a very nice experience for me is I do arts and crafts activities for young children. And I did an activity with a group of 6-year-olds where we imagined, I designed like an outline of a hypothetical city. And we talked about, like, at a level of a 6-year-old, like, what does it mean to like care for your neighbors? What does a caring town look like? What does a caring city look like? And then they developed their own legend regarding like all of the things that they would imagine a caring city would have. And it was just so beautiful, like having these 6-year-olds being like, I feel really good at the park, I feel really safe here and there. And like, there was 10 maps that were produced, none of them included the police, but they did include things like, oh, like what if somebody gets hurt? Like we need like ambulances, we need nurses, we need like, and so they talked about these things, but it was just so interesting to me that none of them had brought up the police. And there could be many reasons to that. There could be like just their lived experience, what they have and have not interacted with. But then it's just this idea of what, like the conversation that I had with you, Sarah, a while back, of like, some of these ideas are not necessarily radical. It just, then going back to Carlos's comment, is that we have these like fear-driven narratives that make us really, really hesitant to do things differently. And then Yusra and I were reflecting on like the ways that things are done in like the Arab world or like the Islamic world. And we have certain values and certain like systems of caring for each other and protecting each other that have been displaced in our communities by imperialism and colonialization. And it's really sad because it's like we had like cultural, spiritual, religious, like just tools that we relied on for so long, and then they were all eradicated. And now we have to rely on the capitalist system. We have to rely on the colonial system. And it's so hard to like imagine ourselves beyond that, because these things have been violently taken away from us. But it was possible then. Could it be possible now? So yeah, so we were kind of talking about this idea of like going back to our roots, going back to our stories of our ancestors, seeing what their ideas are, seeing the way that they took care of each other. As simple as this idea of like just like love for people around us. It's just like very foundational, fundamental things that I'm so like lucky to like have like kids tell me it on a regular basis, because like these things like they express, and I feel like as adults we don't get a lot of spaces where we talk about like the very basics, and then we forget them because we're caught up in such the very violent systems. So yeah, so I just kind of wanted to round off on that, that as much as I love learning in this classroom, I think looking to children and engaging with them is also a really wonderful way to learn.
Thank you so much, Razan. And I agreed with you. Some of the most profound learning comes from not from places that have been exalted as places of learning, but from the simple the simplicity of what it means to be human that has not yet been co-opted by the state and by, like you say, fear narratives. So thank you so much. I would have loved to have been in your class with the students. It sounds like it was very powerful and very encouraging. All right, here is something that has been very indicative of our time together, like that we could always have way more time to discuss. So I want to make sure that, is there a representative from harm reduction that would like to share just some of the things that you talked about in terms of the movement and in terms of the conversation around harm reduction? Adding to, because all of these things are completely interlinked as well. So I'm hoping you heard some things that were spoken about today by our first group, echoing into the work that you did in your group. Who is our representative from harm reduction?
I think we didn't pick a representative, but it was Yusur. Okay, I see Yusur, and yes, and sorry, it was Dea and then Elin. So if anybody has, and Eliza. So if anybody can contribute, but I'm going to go off of our Jam board because we got to populate it at least for the first two questions, and the last question we weren't able to get through. But we were talking about like who makes up the movement, and so and the population that they work with. So it's people who use substances, and we talked about some of the challenges that they're facing. So there's a lot of intersection of stigma, class, access to financial resources, and then this often gets intertwined with notions of marginalization and acts of criminalization, and so there's these social tensions in local communities. That also is a major challenge that needs to be addressed. So we were talking about like neighbors who live next to, for example, like harm reduction centers. There's sometimes tension between them and the substance users, the people who run the center, and how we talked about like how do you address that tension? And I think storytelling was what we came to as an intervention, and this idea of humanizing the people who use harm reduction interventions, because oftentimes their narrative and like just who they are gets lost in it all by very harmful hegemonic narratives. So acts of storytelling, we were talking about like public art. Dea shared an example. So if you guys go on the Jam board, there's an example of a mural in downtown Eastside Vancouver. And then we talked about a few other ones like public art intervention, street theater. Oh, thank you. Yes. Street theater, invisible theater. Actually, invisible theory, I'm going to read that one out.
So for some reason, Razan, your mic just went out.
Oh, is it better now?
Yeah, now it's better. Yeah.
Okay. I accidentally covered it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just reading the description for Invisible Theater, and then there's street theater, music video, public art intervention. There's a link there to more murals if anybody wants to check it out. And there was a day of awareness and action. I think that was very much inspired by the reading on the Thousand Crosses. So yeah, so we just found like tools of storytelling and really sharing the experiences and like how there is yeah, said it in a really beautiful way, but I can't, maybe she can pitch in, but this idea of like people want to change to the better. They want to live in healthier communities. They want to live in better communities. They want to live in safer communities. And we need to be centering their narratives as opposed to treating them as disposable. I can't even say community members at that point, because if they were truly community members, then you wouldn't treat them as disposable. But that's the unfortunate reality of people who use substances. So yeah, those are some of the things we talked about.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Razan. And I mean, I think that many of the groups that we are talking about, people end up being dehumanized and no longer become members of the community, but become systemically excluded and invisible once they are slotted into a particular, and they become identified by one of their by one action, rather than looking at people in the wholeness of who they are. And I think that that's what our system, what the state does, what our systems do as well. Thank you so much for showing that. I think definitely I heard echoes of the conversation around prison abolition and the construction of society and fear-based narratives. Our final group, I know we're reaching our 11:30 mark. If you have to leave, you are so welcome to do so. I know you're heading off to your next assignment or your next class or your work or whatever those things are, but I'll keep the recording going. And I'm hoping that someone from the anti-psychiatry movement group will still be around to share with us the richness of your discussion. Is there someone? Zahida.
Carlos, feel free to jump in too. I can start us off. We started talking about humor, and Montessori had the idea of just making memes to kind of show like the absurdity of the psychiatric system. So and then we also had an idea of like a pop-up clinic where we would be also like farcically making fun of like people come in, but then we're actually diagnosing what's wrong with the system and with psychiatrists and stuff like that. And then we talked a little bit about hearing from mental health patients themselves. So because we talked about how sometimes one of the issues with the strategy of anti-psychiatry is that the pharmaceutical industry also has storytelling power. So like the anti-psychiatry movement will put something forward, and then the psychiatry movement can say, oh, but look, like this poor innocent person was harmed by this schizophrenic person. So actually hearing to humanize from mental health patients so that it's harder to cast them in that light. Carlos, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, the other aspect I think that we spoke about too is just the fact that, like, you know, the labeling that comes with psychiatry is, like, you know, just as harmful as, like, you know, the actual and sometimes even more than that, because of how society views someone that's on medications and so on and so forth. But the other thing that we also discuss is just the fact that there needs to be money poured into this movement for research purposes, just because the fact that, like, it is such a one-sided industry where the masses do not hear about, like, the harms of psychiatry. And something like, the Bonnie Burstow's scholarship, I feel like is really powerful, just because, one, it's never existed before, but the need for more research to be done. And I also just wanted to say what in her video, this one line that she made really stuck out to me, is the fact that we currently have bad research driving out good, and we need good research to drive out the bad. So there needs to be that counter narrative to psychiatry, which I currently doesn't exist. And I think that's why there is, once again, like, the power of the industry being able to dictate whatever they want to. So I feel like that's one of the biggest challenges, that there needs to be funding and credibility done. So therefore, institutions and people can understand, like, okay, this really needs to be further research, so that way we can kind of move the needle towards that, because as it currently stands, like, it's such a powerful institution that it bleeds into other aspects, to other institutions, educational, prison, academia. So it also speaks to the fact that, like, it's not gonna be, change is not gonna happen right away. I think, it's gonna take a generation or two to really have an impact of changing things. So those were, yeah, those are some of the things that we discussed. And also, just like, something like the MAD movement is also very powerful, because it gives the voice, it gives back the power to those individuals. So just having their voices heard too is also very educational, and you need that. That's what Professor Burstow stated, that you need to tell the story to educate, to really bring about change. So yeah, if I missed anything.
I think what I really appreciate, Zahida and Carlos, about the discussion, what you brought to the discussion, building on some of the theoretical conversations that we've had, is that you talked about some really practical things as well, and ways of disrupting the narrative that were practical. So whether those were creative or whether those were research based, and I also think you're all in an academic institution, and so there is space, I think, on all levels. So whether you're in an institution and you're doing research, and that the way that you do that research, and the way that you disrupt narratives and share stories in a particular way, and doing things within the community, that things need to happen on so many different levels for change to happen, and for those fear narratives, and for those narratives that we feel that we're locked into, that systemically exclude some people and other individuals. So I think those things are all important. I am actually sure that it would be, we could actually talk for another hour and a half about any of these things. Next week, we will not have a formal session, but you're welcome to take the time that you need to work on an assignment, or to drop by just to have a conversation, to ask about assignments, just to have a conversation with each other. But I'll leave it more open, and I won't make it mandatory. Although mandatory optional. When you're a graduate student, that's something different. You're always making a choice. But I will have an opportunity to also reflect in our final session together. And there's a few questions that I've included in week 12 in preparation for the last session, to kind of be thinking about the learning, and also thinking about what your next steps are. How will you join? How will you continue to join the revolution? What kinds of activities? Where do you find yourself? And where do you want to go? Yeah, Carlos.
Yeah, no, thank you, Professor. I know, just the other thing that just came to mind, just wanted to mention, is just the fact that the other key thing that we shortly discussed is the fact that, with this movement, it creates lifetime, depending on your diagnosis or whatever, with the labeling, I'm sorry, a lifetime consumer, like meaning that, like, like in order for you to function, you need to be on these kinds of medications. So therefore, which I think is what pharmaceutical and this industry wants you to be on, just dependent on us. So I think that's the other aspect too that doesn't get talked about, is like how you can become a consumer, and then you can also from there become brought into other institutes, like your pipeline. You then get fed into other pipelines of it. So I think that's also another key aspect too, of how they build consumers out of people.
I appreciate that very much. 15 years ago, the term that was used for someone who came out of the psychiatric system was consumer survivor. And I remember the first time that I heard that, I was like, are you talking about like people surviving retail therapy? Like, I don't like, what are you talking about? But that was a term that was used a lot. Now the discourse has shifted a little bit, but the idea was exactly what you're talking about, that we create consumers. In a capitalist society, people are forced to be consumers and forced to become dependent on medication, on healthcare services, and there are all sorts of statistics that talk about the cost of keeping someone in psychiatric care versus supportive community-based care. And the difference is literally like $1,500 per day per person. So it's like $33 a day in a community-based supportive environment, and about $1,500 per day for someone who's in the psychiatric system, when you take into consideration all of the different resources that are used to maintain that system. And a lot of that is taxpayer dollars. So when I worked for a few years with the Mennonites, and met a bunch of Quakers. So I went overseas, but I spent some time in the US, and I met all of these fantastic like activists that were anti-war activists. And so some of them lived their lives where they didn't want to contribute. So they wanted to live under $8,000 a year because they didn't want to pay any taxes. Others had been arrested numerous times because they made 51% of the US budget goes towards military. And so they would make a public showing of donating that tax money to a peace organization, and then got arrested for it for tax evasion. But that was actually looking at, so what kind of control do we have? Where does our money go? Because it's actually our money in the society, in a democratic society that has a tax-based system to run the country. It's our tax money that actually feeds and allows for systems to be perpetrated. And so it's a very interesting thing. I met some of these people. I met a 72-year-old woman who got arrested for the second time of trespassing on the School of the Americas. And their campaign was, "Don't let your child grow up to kill my child." And so it was a bunch of older women and a bunch of, and they all got arrested. And she spent 2 years in prison for resistance. So I'm not suggesting that, but then she wrote this incredible work based on the time that she spent in prison. Yeah, so anyway, like there are so many ways to resist, and in a democratic society, like Carlos, I appreciate you talking about that consumer piece, because we do have more power than we think we have to ask for change, because it's actually our tax money that drives and supports the systems that exist. It's not 100% clear how we make those changes, but as everyone has talked about today, there are multiple ways to address it, and each one of us can engage in different ways to making change. And I have no doubt that as I hear your conversations, hear you confronting knowledge and discussing and sitting in a place of feeling uncomfortable with what exists, that you will be counted in the numbers of people that continue to make change. So any last comments before I stop our stop our conversation or end our class for today? The conversation should continue for a long time, and I always enjoy continuing to talk with my students once the semester is over. There's always a place for you at my table, and the offering of a pizza oven meal. We have a wood-burning pizza oven in our backyard, and so if you're ever in Hamilton, you're always welcome to come and continue the discussion with me. Maybe Dea, that's not as easy for you, or Yelin as well. But if those of you who are in the region, you are always welcome to connect with me after the semester as well. Tanya.
Just a quick question. I know you'll probably come across it because I did my first reflection on it, on harm reduction. And
yeah,
I've done a lot of my work previously, like career-wise, with younger folks. And I know that folks have mixed occupations in space. So harm reduction's always been a hard sell working with adolescents, because it sounds like the promotion of what others feel are harmful circumstances, drug use and sex trade, right? So I don't know if folks have come across appropriate ways to both destigmatize, but also warn against the perils of participating, or is that even appropriate to warn against the challenges? And that's one part. And then my second part around harm reduction is, I know that there's a hierarchy to needs, you know, but when you're dealing with a person, meeting them where they are at and dealing with the challenges that systemically uphold whatever it is that they're participating, whether it be drug use or partnership in sex work. Is there an idea that the end result isn't, because in our presentation that week, it said that abolition shouldn't be a goal. And I look at it the same way as I do when I work with folks who live with various incomes. I wouldn't necessarily, scorn them for buying cheaper and unhealthier foods, but I'm also not going to promote it to folks who can afford to eat healthier. So when folks get to a place where they've addressed their other needs, when they're stable income and they're living somewhere and they're building communal connections, are we still saying to them that, yeah, it might be safe to keep using drugs? Is there a physical response to these illicit drugs that might not be good for persons that we also need to make folks mindful of? I don't know what the responsibility is.
Good questions, like really, really good questions. I don't think in terms of harm reduction, when it says that abolition is not a goal in harm reduction, it doesn't mean that it can't be a goal, but that for some people, it's actually physically not possible. So for example, something like an opiate addiction can completely rewire your brain. And the addiction piece, and Dea is nodding her head as a health practitioner, right? Like, so, but I think that this idea of that harm reduction should be looking at how you can support each individual where they're at, because there are always driving forces behind why someone is connected with a property that causes addiction. So should you be saying to youth, so it like saying if youth are addicted already, there's a reason why they got into it, and there are a multitude of reasons why addiction occurs, and some of them are psychological, some of them are physical, like, so there are and a combination of both. And so it would health and wellness and safety of an individual, I think, should be key. Okay. But the harm reduction movement is seeking to support people on a journey towards greater health, wellness, and safety, but acknowledging that abstinence isn't going to be the answer for everyone, for a variety of reasons. We don't have a system that I mean, there's a whole industrial complex around drug use, right? There's and so I don't Dea, do you have from a health-based perspective, what would you say to that?
So Tanya, your question was that, like, if you're teaching youth about harm reduction, is it important to tell them the physiological effects that could happen if they use it? Was that the question?
That's what when money comes down, because that's where it comes, right? Typically downwards from decentralized funding. It's always for young folks, it's about preventative measures. It's about sharing the harms and the risks. That's what their ideas of harm reduction is to decrease the possibility that young people will get involved. So a lot of the work that I've done hasn't been targeted towards young people who are already participating. They might be doing so, we wouldn't know. But a lot of the framework is that we're hoping that they're not, and we're hoping that they won't, and that's the messaging. But in doing that, we're often stigmatizing people who are using and participating, right? So I've had a lot of difficulty tiptoeing that line of being like, I don't want to tell them it's not the worst thing in the world if this is what you're doing. There are people who are experiencing this. I try to focus on why people might be experiencing that. Yeah. But then I also don't want to, in that same space, be advocating for it and saying, like, if you've also suffered a physical or sexual abuse, that you should turn to drugs as a solution. I don't want to promote that either, right? So that's also the challenge that I've been coming up against.
I think that's so tough. Like, there's definitely like two realms, and this all has to do with like childhood development too, right? Like how they're able to process information, and if they can trust. That's like one of the things that kids learn early on, is like when they're toddlers, is trusting people and not trusting people. But if they've gone through trauma, that's not there. So yes, like I've done education where like we show someone who has healthy lungs and like a smoker's lung, and we inflate them, and kids are really curious, and they're like, that's what really happens inside your body. Because I think if you make it simple for kids, and it depends what age range, obviously, right? Like this is more like, I would say preteens, if they can see an issue and how it would affect you, that could maybe deter their curiosity. But for kids who are a little bit older, like teenagers, I don't think they care so much because of you can say like rebellion. So maybe not showing them like how it would affect them and telling them, they're not going to understand. Like we all did dumb stuff when we were kids, even though we knew what the consequences were. So I think you are right in saying that we should fund more in terms of trauma-informed care and harm reduction for kids. It gets really hairy though, because technically kids don't have rights because of parents, right? So you have to really go through them. Like, is it okay if I teach X, Y, and Z? I don't know what it's like for each province, but definitely like
for sure.
In the States, like sex education is a big no-no.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's kind of the issue when it comes to kids, because they don't have, their brain is not fully developed until you're 23. So even the decision making that they're doing is not that of a rational person yet, because they don't have the wiring. And if they've already gone through the trauma, that wiring is going to make the decision making even harder. So focusing your education on, like, through a trauma-informed lens might help.
Yeah.
But yeah, you don't want to promote things, but you also, and like enable, but you don't want to have a gap in that knowledge. So I would say, like, if you are going towards kids, like, definitely involve their parents.
Yeah.
And definitely involve like the education system, because there are a lot of like public health initiatives that nurses take on. Like, we go to schools and we teach X, Y, and Z, from sex ed all the way to drug use.
Yeah.
So working with health clinicians might also be really beneficial.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's honestly a really tough line, because I see kids who are like 18, you can't even drink yet, and they use fentanyl 4 or 5 times a day.
Yeah.
And a lot of people that I've spoken to, I ask, like, why do you use, usually it's fentanyl. And a lot of people just say, like, it feels like a big hug.
Mm.
And that's really sad, because like that means that their childhood development and the events that happened did not provide them comfort and sustainability in terms of love and all these things. And if we can focus more on that and not just the drug use, it's more on how can we like envelop children in love and confidence and self-esteem and good decision making. That would prevent a whole lot of crap that happens in adulthood.
Yeah.
So I think the focus should be more definitely on childhood development in a healthy way. But I don't know, I could talk about this for hours.
Yeah. No, that's that. Thank you so much, Dea. Like, that's I had this interesting space of teaching undergrads who are 17 and 18 about trauma-informed care and crisis intervention. And it's always interesting because it ends up being, so it's a new approach, although it's not for them, they've never encountered it before, although it's very, it's definitely widely used around mental health and social services in terms of trauma-informed care. But also already having a number of students in my courses, first of all, having experienced trauma, but acknowledging that, but then also how they're dealing with their own trauma, and they're training to be social workers. And so it's an interesting thing to talk through that. And I bear this this tension between teaching information, but then also trying to get people, like, acknowledging that people are coming from very different experiences and are currently living different realities as well. And so that's tricky. So I try to dissolve this idea of clients and practitioner to just talking about how we support each other. And rather than, and I mean, trauma-informed care also separates action from an individual, which our structures do not. So actions then define an individual, but it is a response to an experience that is actually the issue. And it's a behavior that develops, and with addiction to substances, that's complicated by all of the physical pieces that exist within that as well. And yeah, have you read anything by Gabor Mate?
I haven't.
You haven't? Okay,
it's really good.
You would a Hungarian doctor who came to Canada as an immigrant, was a Holocaust survivor, and as a kid, and has done a lot of work in downtown East Vancouver. I will send out, just in my email that I send out after this class, a number of suggestions. I mean, I wish, this is another thing about, but there's in the realm of hungry ghosts is I'll send this out in the email, but it's looking at humanizing addiction, and by looking at, like Dea was talking about, the absence that happens around development and the loss of connection, which is really what one of the responses to violence is a loss of connection. And I mean, he's written a number of books. Another person is Levine, and who talks about healing trauma, and talks about the impact of trauma on the body, which also, yeah, I can see you, Sir, leaning into her screen to see this, but I'll add a number of those books. Just if you want to follow up on that, we could do a whole course on the impact that trauma has on and the root of violence, because it's actually the violence that causes the trauma. And so it's also, in my mind, I always define the fact that trauma isn't actually the issue. Trauma is a natural response to experiences of violence. And when that becomes invisible, when we're not actually thinking about the violence, that's a problem.
Very quick question. At some point in OISE, there was a trauma-informed care course taught. Was it Bonnie as well? If you have any recollection of that, I remember.
Yeah. So Bonnie had a brilliant course in. I don't think it was called trauma-informed care. I think it was working with survivors of trauma. And and I don't know if they're offering it anymore. So it's not offered.
No, that's what I was hoping for.
It's a brilliant course. I use when I teach about trauma, I use a framework that she introduced, which is focal layers of trauma. So looking at the way that trauma layers on top of each other as one of the frameworks for talking about trauma. And I'm sorry that they don't offer the course anymore. If they did offer it, I would definitely be interested in teaching it, because I think
you're the only candidate available, because faculty, nobody
but
has
you know what, Yusra, I'll talk with Jennifer Sumner and see if that's a possibility. But it's the construction of the course is wonderful, and I mean, Bonnie was so generous in her knowledge. She also made this really interesting challenge to me, which I found so interesting, is to not, how can you talk about trauma without, oh yeah, The Body Keeps the Score. It's also on my,
such a good book.
Also on my bookshelf right here.
It's a little tough to read if you don't have a health background, but like if you keep with it, it's very anti-psychiatry as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Dea. Like it is, and this is so. Bonnie taught from an anti-psychiatry, critical psychiatry perspective, but also use the DSM. And when I'm teaching about trauma, I talk about how you can use the like the fact that the DSM is one of the structures that we use, but not to label people based on their diagnosis, because navigating our system is so much easier when the DSM, when you actually have a diagnosis, if you want to get resources. However, it's I do a whole critique of the DSM and the questions that you should ask, and talking about it as being one component that should be related to access to resources, but really looking at alternatives and looking at structural issues as well. And the focal layers of trauma, and I can share that as, the author is Bessel van der Klook, and I'll put all of those in the all of those down, Tanya. But the idea, and I'll put the focal layers of trauma, which actually look at all the way from, say, you had a car accident, and that would be an event that happens now, but then looking at all of the layers of trauma that might exist, which includes systemic oppression. So which could include race, gender, sex, all of those different pieces. And all the way down, her final layer, I think layer 7, is actually talking about our separation from the natural world and the trauma that causes. And so all of those pieces are, I'll look at you, Dea, thank you so much for sharing that. But all of those pieces and how they come together. And so when you're dealing with one trauma, there's also this link that happens, and so someone's reaction to something that happens today is connected to lots of experiences of violence. And we are more vulnerable, and not to say anything about resiliency, because we're also resilient, but we are also more vulnerable to a particular event as well. So for instance, they also look at systemic things or experiences that might be societally based. So if you come from a conflict zone, that is going to contribute, that violence impacts you. It impacts everyone, but also, so lots of interesting things. And I will look into whether the course is still offered, and I'll follow up with you, because it is a really important, and part of that course was actually designing a trauma-based resource to work with a particular population.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Because I work obviously in healthcare, sometimes I have an issue with the anti-psychiatry movement because it doesn't necessarily highlight the people who have been helped within psychiatry. So I feel like if the anti-psychiatry movement is obviously like the goal is kind of abolition, what happens to the people who found solace within psychiatry? Because I do see people who have been helped. I don't know obviously what percentage, but what about, what about the streams of resources that people actually use and find beneficial?
Yeah, so this is why despite my 14 years of conversation with Bonnie Burstow, I never crossed to being completely anti-psychiatry, because I actually think I'm very critical psychiatry, but and I think we need to, our system is not serving most people within it. But I also, when I had a doctor in my course 2 years ago, and she did her whole project on anti-psychiatry because she was so fascinated by it. She'd done one session on psychiatry as part of her. She was a general practitioner, and but it is interesting when you actually see people who experience freedom from. I had another student who came from public health and was a naturopathic doctor, and talked about a struggle with deciding to go on anti-anxiety medication because of her experience and what that had done in terms of her in terms of improving her quality of life. So I think that it's a system, but there are always going to be people that and there are people, I mean, even in our conversation on the Anti-Psychiatry Week, there was an interesting discussion around microdosing and psychedelics and the use of those by people who are part of Kappa, right? And there are people that I've met as part of Kappa who actually take medication and would take medication to support their healthy living. The idea of incarceration based on symptoms and based on a different way of thinking and being is what the anti-psychiatry movement is attacking. And Bonnie's book,
Take your time.
Yeah, no, I have it on my shelf, I'm sure, but just about the something of madness of psychiatry, anyway. too many books, but when she actually does an institutional ethnographic approach to psychiatry and the business of madness. And that's her book. Like that really highlights some of the pieces. And you read that book and you're like, oh my gosh. And yet I remember when I was in my master's degree, I was in a women and gender studies course, and I was like totally like blown away by this anti-psychiatry movement. And I chose as my project to be involved in the Stop Shocking Our Mothers and Grandmothers, where we made those big puppets and we did a whole, like, so I was, you know, on a bit of a soapbox in all my other classes talking about this learning, right? So we learned something new, we want to share it. And then there was a nurse in my class who said, look, I totally agree with you. Like ECT shouldn't be used to the extent that it is. But she said, I worked with a woman for 4 years who was completely psychotic, who couldn't connect to reality, who was a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. And the ECT erased her memories and allowed her to live a normal life because there was so much horror. She'd seen her whole family perish. And so she said, I'm not going to completely discount that this could be a support to someone based on their history and their experience of violence. And I was like, okay, when you actually are not talking theoretically, but you're talking experientially, how can I argue to that?
I think that's the realm that I live in, because I see how medication can help people. And I'm like in the middle. Like I do agree people can have medication to be better, quote unquote. But it can also be quite violent in how we use medications and other procedures and stuff. And I'm more in the realm of we should really look at plant medicine to help, because there's lots of research now with MAPS to help like psychedelics and with PTSD and how it helps. And I think that's how we should be funding. However, big pharma makes a whole lot of money on us because we use antidepressants. They even found levels of antidepressants in the water because it's so prevalent. It's just so easy.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think there needs to be more education for clinicians about the long-term effects generationally of how we prescribe medication.
Yeah, there was a very interesting podcast that I listened to last year. I had some trouble with insomnia last year, and you know, everyone was sending me like, do this, Bethany, do that, blah, 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 like everyone that I knew. And someone sent me a podcast that was actually looking at, and everyone also, I had a bunch of people said, Bethany, use cannabis. It will 100% cure your insomnia. And so, but I listened to a podcast that was really interesting, where the person who did a lot of the talking on it was the head researcher at the Cannabis Research Institute at McMaster University. And he said, the problem is, yes, anecdotally, someone's going to tell you that, that cannabis helped them with pain, cannabis helped them with sleep, cannabis helped them with whatever. But then you could also have the same number of people tell you how it completely was disruptive, because we don't know enough, because there hasn't been enough investment in, because it was illegal for so long. The kind of research that's been done hasn't been like, it doesn't inform our understanding of how plant-based medications or supplements actually impact individuals, and what are the other factors, and what are the interactions. So it's a tricky thing for sure. And because it's not going to serve, if all of a sudden depression or insomnia could be treated with some edibles or a toke, that would severely impact pharmaceuticals, because so many people are on sleeping medications and pain medications. I have an aunt with fibromyalgia who uses CBD oil on her gums every night, and that's the only thing that's ever helped her with her chronic pain. But the next person might not be helped in exactly the same way.
Yeah, for sure. Like I definitely, with my palliative clients, I try to use more natural approaches if they're open to it, because the amount of sedation that we get with opioids is so beyond like what I can even fathom, and that decreases their quality of life because they're not present with their family. Obviously, definitely take the medication if it helps. And that's the only time I would really suggest someone use opioids is when they are palliative, because what's the harm? They're going to pass anyways, and we know it's quite imminent, versus having a long-term addiction to it. And I actually had one of my coworkers say, why would you suggest somebody use CBD when it hasn't been researched? Like a nurse on my own unit. And I had to pull up research articles for him. And I had to say, mind your business and let me work with my clients. Like, this is not up to you.
Yeah.
And especially in Vancouver, like, you know, BC Bud is the best. We know this. There's a huge, huge compassionate community with research on how to use X, Y, and Z in a way that can help.
Nice.
Yeah.
The great. I mean, and really, yeah, I think that needs to be part of the conversation, and where we invest research dollars as well, is important in changing structures. So yeah, I'm aware that we have this, see, we could keep discussing for a long time. Tanya and Euster, did you have anything were you sticking around just for the discussion?
Yeah.
Totally fascinated. I love hearing, especially from Daya. She always provides like these
Yeah,
really
agreed.
insights from the heart of the action. Yeah, I don't know. Daya,
Love it.
thank you so much. Like your insights are really like a missing link in lots of the learning I'm doing about Canada in general, and demystifying this whole myth of, oh, the land of the whatever and immigrant friendly. Like I always contest it with real stories, and your voice has been
Yeah.
Come to Vancouver anytime. We can hang out.
I have to. Like, apparently that's all that's available for me. My imagination does not include going across Canadian borders for the coming period. I'm still trying to get used to people not wearing masks in supermarket. I see them very individuals, and I'm like, oh, we have to in the local one, so that's it. They're known, and the rest are like, nah. So baby steps to re-socialization.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you everyone for thoughtful questions. I will follow up with all of the different resources that I talked about in the email later this afternoon, once I get the video converted and up. And thank you for the gift of your time and your willingness to engage in discussion and to ask really good questions, all of you, and keep asking questions. And thank you so much. You make my life richer.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Okay, take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.